Rev up your engines! Still have an old 94 BMW, keeps draining the battery. Here's what you do. First you got to decide what kind of a meter you're going to use. Now there's all kinds of meters out there. I got this Fluke meter. Costs a lot of money. Look at all the choices you have, all the buttons, all the plugs. It's overkill for people that are working on their own car. I have this somewhat cheaper oscilloscope multimeter. It's got less stuff, but it still has a lot of things you have to learn. There's lots of possibilities of where you can plug the plugs in. Again, it's overkill for most people. Instead, I'm going to use this Voltcraft one. I think it was 89 bucks or something. One, simple to use because it's only got 2 leads, positive and negative. You don't have to worry about, God, what do I plug it in? Which one goes where? And the advantage of this is not only can you plug leads in, but it's got a non-contact. So you can put this around wires to measure stuff. Simplicity, only 2 plugs. And when you turn it on, there's only 2 choices you have. As you can see here, this is AC volts. Well, we're working on cars, so most of the time, we just push the button. Then it's DC millivolts. That's the only thing I sometimes forget. Put it on DC, because you'll get weird readings with AC working on a car. Now, you can use the AC for various computer things on the car, yeah. And on modern electric cars, sure. But for a conventional car with a regular 12-volt battery in it, this thing's set up on DC, just push the DC button, is all you're going to need. It's simple, easy to use, it's accurate. These small things, hey, you don't really need big anymore. This is a lot newer than this. So it's got a lot of automated features that they never used to have. And for like 89 bucks, you really can't go wrong. Since it does AC, you can use it in your house too. Now the problem with this car is when it sits, the battery drains to nothing. He changed the alternator and the battery, no difference whatsoever. It still drains it. So here's the first thing you want to check. We'll go to the battery, which in this case is in the trunk. And for now, we're going to use the inductive one, so we'll unplug these. We'll put it on the battery, but first we'll zero it. It's got a 0 button. Now it's zeroed, and we will put it on here. An old car, and about 50 milliamps is the max you want to get. And in this case, it's not 50 milliamps, it's 893 milliamps. If it was there, it would be 1 amp, which would be a big drain. But this is 896 milliamps. Now some modern cars, like Mercedes, they might have as much as an 85 milliamp draw because all the computer systems. This is 896. It's well over 10 times that. So now we got to figure out where is the draw. This is a relatively older car. It's a 94. We're going to start by pulling fuses and see if it drops down. And then if it drops, that fuse powers what knocks it out. But in very modern cars, where everything is computerized, leave the fuses in and test them. I'll show how to do that later in a video because it's relatively time consuming and you need a little chart, but the chart's free. I just use the powerprobe.com website and they have which size fuses and which draw means what. I'll show you that later, but for now we're just going to pull fuses. Now the main fuse box is here. We're going to pull the fuses out one at a time and see what happens. There's one, it's still 865. There's two, still about the same, 864, 865. Yes, indeed, it's a long, boring process, but we must continue. There's another one. Well, that didn't make any difference, so let's try something different. We'll pull out a whole row. So I pulled out the whole row, and now let's see what happens. It's just down to 8 millivolts, so it's one of those. So now we put them back one at a time. We'll just double check that. We'll pull that one out, and we know that's part of the problem. Went back up, but it's still not the huge amount. So there's more than one problem. So we'll start putting the rest of them back in. We'll do 2 at a time just to make it faster. And there we go. Now it's 762. That's the big drain. Let's remove the 30 amp one first. See what happens. It's down all the way to 65. So there's still smaller drains, but that's the huge one. 700 milliamps. We're just going to leave it out and we'll let it sit. He says it'll drain in 2 or 3 days. Well, it's staying in an acceptable range so far. It's just 26 millivolts. Let's put the rest of them in. 6 more. In they go. Staying at 25. No, it's a toy for the guy. He doesn't use it that much. So we're going to let it sit a few days. See if it'll keep starting up. Here's what I was telling you. If you have a more modern car, sometimes pulling the fuses actually creates a problem. It diagnoses because there's so many modules. And they're all interconnected. You pull one fuse, it can affect another module or a relay. So Here's how you can test the more modern cars. Use the same meter, only this time you plug the leads in, put on volts, and like I said, remember, that's AC. Push the button, so it's DC volts. Then you measure across the fuses. It's that simple. We know the 30 amp one's a bad one, so, and as you can see, it's measuring 12.45 volts. This is a massive short in that system. It should measure almost nothing. As you can see here, when we measure a top fuse that we pulled and it made no difference, meaning there's no short, it shows 1/10 of a millivolt, which is nothing. That's not even recordable. You often get a reading of 1/10 or 1/20th of a millivolt. Like I said, it can be up to 50 to 85 millivolts. 30 amp fuse shorted out. Now, if it was a smaller draw, there's these charts. Like I say, you can get them free. PowerPro.com has them, and you see what your millivolt reading was on the side. You see the size of the fuse. Then it will show you the actual draw. But in this case, it's a full voltage draw, not millivolts, 12 volts. We'll just leave that fuse out, let it sit for a few days, see if it stopped draining. I'm guessing it certainly will. Just a curiosity and safety. We'll start it up and then we'll see if anything we need doesn't work now, like brake lights, stuff like that. We'll check the power windows. They still work. That's still working. That's still working. Signals, they're still working. Horn, that's still working. AC system, it's still working. And while we're waiting a few days for it to sit and see if it restarts and doesn't drain the battery, realize if you do have a more modern car, every time you run the car and shut it off, sometimes it can take an hour or two or even more for all the modules to go to sleep. So you can't do that modern test measuring at the fuses, the millivolts, because a lot of the computer stuff will be using power for an hour or two or even more. So testing a modern car is a royal pain in the butt, because you got to waste at least a couple hours for all the modules to set down. That's why the older cars were much better to own and to fix, because they don't have all the computer crap that can go wrong and pull your hair out. This guy took this car to a bunch of people. They couldn't find what was wrong. You could see what it'd take me 10 minutes to figure out where the problem was. A few days later, notice I got a different shirt. Got 2 pockets instead of 1. I'm not all covered in sweat because it's still early in the morning, but I can feel the sweat's coming. So, let's see if it starts. So there you have it. Since everything else is working, we don't care. It's an old car. If it was a brand new car, you'd have to trace through everything, see what it actually operated. But this is a toy for the guy, so who cares? Now he'll be able to let it sit and start it up every once in a while and drive it. To be a safe side, let's shut it off and check drain. It goes between 6 and 4. Of course, under 50 is perfect. But that is such a small drain. Now you can see, you can find a short in your own car. It's not that complex. And you don't have to buy a $900 meter either. This little $80 meter works perfect, and it's simpler to use. Less things you have to know. You're only dealing with cars, but at the same time it does AC. You can do your house with it too. And here's some bonus questions and answers. Daywalker says, I got an 09 Hummer. My rack and pinion boot on the outside is torn. Can I wait and drive it anywhere? Yeah, probably can. Realize the boots are one thing. Those are just dust shields. They're to keep dust from getting on the rack that goes in and out. The seal is actually inside on the rack, and then the rod goes back and forth, and the seal keeps it from leaking. You don't want to have all the dust and dirt eventually wear the seal out. But on a trip, one trip isn't going to destroy anything. It is a dust shield. One other thing to look at is, okay, the boot's ripped. If you see fluid inside the boot coming out, then it's too late. That means that the seal's already been damaged. There's nothing inside that bellows. Stare. And if you got fluid inside there now, that means that the seal's already been damaged. Eventually you'll have to replace the rack because the seal's letting pressure come out. It should be dry inside. That means the seal has been damaged. Realize that. Stephen W. says I get shaking and a vibration between 35 60 miles an hour. Got no 08 Lexus ES350 with 221,000 miles. It shakes when I accelerate between 35 and 60. It only does it at those speeds. My tires and balance CV axles look like they're good. There's no leaking fluid. Hell, have a guy like me check the transmission and motor mounts. It's old enough that they could be worn a little and it'll do that. Pray it's something like that, because if the tires and wheels are fine and the axles are fine, that would mean shaking, vibrating between 35 35 and 60, if it's the whole vehicle, not just the steering wheel, the whole vehicle shakes, that would mean your transmission's starting to go out. Even Lexuses wear out eventually. And that's how they do it. When you're going 35 to 60, you accelerate hard. If it's really vibrating, it's internal wear on the transmission. And once you get over 60 and they're in a different gear, they stop vibrating. Especially if it doesn't vibrate when you go from 60 to 80, it's probably internal to the transmission in the lower gears, which is a lot of money to fix. But like I say, check the transmission mounts and motor mounts. Maybe you're lucky they're just broken or torn. You get a jack, put it under there, jack it up, see if they separate and they're broken, and replace the broken one. Pray it's that simple and not an internal failure. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.